From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Oregon growers are really interested in creating pollinator habitat on their farms, and although there's a lot of great ideas out there, we really lack a lot of the nitty-gritty details on how to get it done, how to make cost-effective pollinator habitat fit in agricultural areas. Now, this fall, we're going to be rolling out here at OSU a new Pollinator Stewards program, and there is a sign-up sheet if you are interested in signing up and getting some skills. You can go to extension.oregonstate.edu/pollinator-steward. There's a sign-up sheet, but this episode we're going to get into some of those nitty-gritties with somebody who's thought a lot about this. Rebecca Sweet is the owner of Buzz Cover Crop Seeds. Rebecca's worked very extensively in the Pacific Northwest. In this episode, we're going to talk about how to create pollinator habitat in vineyards. Remember, we had an episode previously with Ron Bittner out in Idaho talking about this. There's a lot of interest in vineyards. We have some great vineyards out here in Oregon. Rebecca's going to bring her own experience, which is really interesting. It's interesting to think about the interaction between the crop and the plants that are going in, and how those two things have to really be tweaked perfectly for it to come off. So this week, Rebecca Sweet from Buzz Cover Crop Seeds. Hope you enjoy the episode. You always hear people talk about cover crops and pollinators. It seems to be this a big issue, and people are really interested in it. Why are cover crops important for pollinators, and what kind of role can they play? And tell us a little bit about some of the gaps around here in Western Oregon about actually putting cover crops in for pollinators. Sure.
Yeah. Well, cover crops have been around for a long time. And, at first it was all about soil conservation, and then it was about fertility, and people realized then that cover crops could help break up disease cycles. And so it's always been, and all the research has been about cover crops' role in agronomy and soil conservation.
Oh, I should just stop you for a second. What is for people who don't even know, what is a cover crop? What do people mean by that?
Yeah. So that's kind of what I was starting with there is, it's basically something that's grown that doesn't have a cash value. People aren't going to be harvesting cover crops usually for money. It's something that can be used to fix nitrogen in the case of legumes like clovers and vetches and peas. So they fix nitrogen from the air with a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in their roots, fix atmospheric nitrogen into the soil. And so it basically is like free nitrogen. And so that has been a big role of cover crops. And then, back in the Dust Bowl days, they realized that leaving soil uncovered is just a bad idea. Soil loss it continues to be a problem worldwide, but historically has been a major issue. Our technologies have gotten better, and cover cropping is catching on for those goals.
Okay, that's a cover crop. So traditionally, it had these two roles of soil health and soil retention, and now pollinators are this new thing that people have been thinking about.
Right. Yeah, it's sort of just come to light, obviously, that pollinators have a major role in our ecological picture for multiple reasons, not just a conservation reason in general, but directly to humans' needs to produce food for ourselves, and so that gives them the spotlight that you're putting on them that is well deserved. And cover crops certainly can fill a major major empty void for provide a resource for pollinators, because they all the flowering ones, besides outside of grasses, when I think of flowering cover crops, I think of clovers, for example.
Oh, right.
And all of the legumes that I mentioned earlier have resources for pollinators, such as nectar, and a lot of them have pollen that can sustain pollinators.
So at the same time as they're doing these other things like improving soil health and holding on to soil, they could also be going to flower, and pollinators can be, I guess some of these can be quite large. So you get a big block of flowering plants suddenly in the landscape, which may not have been there.
Absolutely. Yeah. They're cover crops historically have been grown in monocultures. More recently, mixes have been used, and usually they're a mix of some sort of a cereal grain and then a legume. The cereals tend to have more soil building properties. So, those grasses hold the soil. You can imagine a root system of a grass is very fine and has a huge network of deep roots that just build soil structure. And then you mix in with that some other species, usually legumes, because most farmers are looking for some sort of a nitrogen input, depending. And so then you can start playing with the species. What are those species? And think about pollinators when you're choosing those species. For example, a lot of vetches have something called extrafloral nectaries. So that just means that the nectar is born on the outside of the flower, so that any little tiny bodied insect can access that nectar. It doesn't have to be a large bodied insect to work a giant, complicated flower, or have a special long tongue to reach to the bottom of the flower where it's hiding its precious nectar.
Okay. So that's great. So these plants can serve a whole broad range of pollinators, and I guess thinking about cover crops and their implementation in Western Oregon, where are some of the places that cover crops are, and what are some of the limitations to making more of them into pollinator habitat?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of opportunities to establish cover crops for pollinators in Western Oregon. We're blessed with a lot of rain, and so that means that we are less needful of supplemental irrigation.
Oh, right.
So that means that we can throw down a diverse cover crop mix on headlands, for example. And so when I mean a headland, I just mean, like, for example, in a brand new development of a brand new vineyard, for example, which is where most of my career has been. You could throw down, instead of just the grass seeds, you could throw down a diverse mix of seeds and establish that with just the rainfall that's going to be coming in October, for example. So you could throw that down in September and know that you're reliably going to get decent temperatures for germination along with some soil moisture. So yeah, Western Oregon and cover crops are just married. They're meant for each other. It's not hard. The challenge here is too much water sometimes. So there's just some cover crop species that don't do well with wet feet, and also hitting that window of time where you can get out onto the field before it gets too wet, and yet have enough temperature to germinate.
Like I remember this did come up in the episode with Dr. Serkan Atez, and he was talking about a number of legumous species, for example, that really didn't tolerate waterlogging, and others that did, so that it kind of excluded a number of species because in a lot of places in Western Oregon, that field may be partially underwater for a little bit of time.
Right. And also, if you want to get onto a field early in the spring, now I'm thinking about more vegetable systems, you may not want the water holding capacity that cover crops bring. So, they do a great job of retaining water in a field. So if you want to be able to get out onto a field early in the spring, you may not want to have a big, giant, grass, legume cover crop to manage. So in that case, you could maybe just choose species that are shorter. But yeah, that's a factor for a lot of farmers is finding the cover crop mix that fits their cropping calendar and schedule and crop rotation.
Now, you have a background here at OSU working in cover crops and vineyards specifically. Can you just maybe walk us through how vineyards are using cover crops?
Yeah, sure. So, it kind of goes back to that irrigation situation that we talked about earlier. I think this is still true, in the past said that about 50% of Western Oregon vineyards are not irrigated. And a lot of them choose not to use their irrigation even if they have it in place. So that just means that, the things that we're putting down on the ground for cover crops are not going to be irrigated. But when it comes to what we choose to put on the ground, it's going to be a matter of how old the vines are, because the older the vineyard is, the more deeply rooted it is, and the more tolerant it is of the competition that the cover crop is going to put upon that vineyard.
Oh, because the cover crop is going to be planted in the rows between, so their roots may compete for the moisture with the roots of the crop.
Right, absolutely. Okay. And in the case of vineyards, it can be a good thing because we in the wine industry are trying to grow a very high quality product. We're not necessarily trying to grow a very high yielding product. Now, that's not always true, but generally in Oregon Pinot Noir, we're going for a premium product. And so yields are less important compared to quality. So in that case, we want to oftentimes ratchet down the vigor of the vineyard. So depending on how deep your soils are, you may want to establish a cover crop that is competitive. So in that case, it'd be perennial grass based. And there's lots of opportunity to throw in flowering species in that kind of a mix. And if you don't have an old, deeply rooted vineyard, you have a young, establishing vineyard, you would not want to have a competitive floor, vineyard floor. So,
okay, so let me get
in that case, you would have more cereals in this traditional cover crop mix.
Okay, so those grasses are, I guess I'm gathering, are very good at gathering moisture, and so you would really kind of if you were in an established orchard, the kind of cover crop you're looking for is primarily grass. And I did hear you sort of say that does have some opportunities for pollinator plants. Obviously, the grasses aren't pollinator plants. Tell us a little bit about how that would work.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's grasses, the perennial grasses that are deeply rooted and competitive, would be more competitive. And then there are perennial grasses that are not so deeply rooted and essentially just go dormant in the summer. Now, they don't look beautiful and green in the summer because they're not deeply rooted, but they don't die. And they still provide function in terms of supporting the weight of your tractor and providing a nice place for your workers to walk. So just wanted to make sure that you understood there's different kinds of perennial grasses.
I didn't understand it, and I'm not sure the listeners did. So that there are some grasses that are going to just be this nice green carpet, and there are some grasses that are not as deeply rooted, whose strategy it is when they hit that hot summer, they'll dry down, but they still provide
Right.
that nice support during the wet season. So when you're going through the vineyard, the tractor can be supported when it's wet, but when it dries, it may not be. Okay, I didn't understand. That's great. That's a good distinction. So there are these two kinds of contexts in vineyards, and I imagine they offer different opportunities for pollinator plants. If you have a deep-rooted perennial that's going to be green the whole time, that's a different, perhaps, context for incorporating pollinator plants than one that's shallow-rooted and dormant in the summer.
Yeah, I think so. I think in general, though, the more important aspects to the floral part of what goes in a vineyard is going to be stature and tolerance to traffic and the droughty conditions. Because, we don't want, we want really good wind flow through the vineyard, and we want to be able to have a flowering species that is going to flower low, right? So it's not going to be in our way. Otherwise, we're going to be driving over it, and it's just going to get smashed by the tractor, essentially, and nobody can walk down the alleyway if you have goldenrod that's up to your armpit, right? So you need species that are inherently short or will still be functional in terms of a floral resource after mowing. So some species of flowering plants will still bloom after you hack their heads off at 8 inches. So,
but others won't.
That's going to be
they come up
right,
and then they're dead after that point. They're you've terminated them. So okay, so all right, so that you need in all cases, whatever the ground cover, you can't have something that's tall because it's going to get in the way. But you also mentioned airflow, that if it grows up a ways, then the airflow through the vineyard will be decreased, which I imagine leads to disease problems or other kinds of problems.
Yeah, fungal problems. Mostly we're combating powdery mildew in vineyards and also botrytis. And so those are our main fungal enemies in the vineyard. And airflow is always going to help that situation. So earlier we talked about some obstacles to cover cropping, and that's something else I didn't mention is frost. So in the springtime, sometimes our cover crops can get up quite large, and that can obstruct airflow as air drains from the top of the hill to the bottom, which is what you want to reduce frost pressure. So that can be an argument against cover cropping as well. So again, just thinking more about stature of your species more than any other thing sometimes. Definitely up in the top things to consider.
This sounds so complicated. Like, it isn't as, people often start with plant lists. It's like, what's the best plant for pollinators? But in some ways, I think your approach in Buzz Cover Crop Seed, your company's approach is, it's not so much whether the plant is the most superior to pollinators or not. Well, that is a consideration, but also can they fit in this constrained system? Because if I can imagine if it didn't, then nobody would adopt it. It wouldn't serve the function that these grape growers are looking at.
Exactly. It has to fit the system. Otherwise, people are not going to adopt it. So you really have to think about what the objective is on that farm. There's people I'm talking to right now that are organic growers, and they're trying to battle pests with insectary plants. So, those people are on board. They're thinking about, diversity and how to use it to their benefit in their system. But then you have other people that are just putting down grass because that's what they know they need to do, but they don't see that there's an opportunity to enhance habitat right there in front of them. And so what I'm trying to do is just provide a product that they can reach for easily that's going to fit their system. And I think that, I've developed a pretty good mix for vineyard floors, which could easily be put down on any other headland space in any other perennial system or annual. So when I say headland, I mean, areas around the orchard or the berry field or the vegetable field that you use for driving on, road surfaces that are grassed on farms, or areas that are used exclusively for harvest equipment once a year. But you have to have that staging area, for your crews to park in and for your truck to be loaded. So, typically those are grassed and they're mowed during the year and they're used for a few weeks and that's it. Well, the rest of the summer, they could be used by pollinators and other beneficial insects.
That is fantastic. It's a really great marriage of using space wisely and really, but I imagine to come up with these kinds of systems, you have to know those systems well. Like, it's not a matter, one has to sort of like know how the farm works before you can even start to think about coming up with a seed mix like this. Otherwise, it just, it becomes, I think a lot of us have had the experience of trying to promote pollinator mixes and not understanding the system and frustrated that the adoption rates are not that high.
There's a lot of factors. You're right. Farming is complicated. It can be. And ecological farming practices are even more complicated. And I think that, they're sophisticated. And I think that's the draw. It's exciting and interesting. That's why I know so many PhDs that went back to farming. It's like that. There's nothing more interesting or complicated than this. I just have so much respect for the farmers that I know that are employing ecological systems in their systems on their farms. With goals in mind. And so, yeah, there's definitely, you have to think about equipment, for example. That's, definitely something that people have or they don't. And if they don't, where can they get it? Can they get it? Water systems, weediness, that's another factor. Do you have herbicide available on your farm or do you not? If you're certified organic, you may not. So, these are all factors to consider when you're choosing cover crop species.
Well, I think that's a fantastic transition. Let's take a quick break and let's come back and talk about those, because I imagine for a lot of our listeners, people with small farms, but as you pointed out, some of these same practices could be used anywhere you're going to be running machinery over. You have a lawn or something. Let's take a quick break. Let's come back and talk about some of these considerations in terms of establishment and maintenance of this kind of pollinator habitat. Okay, great. Well, that was a great break. I always love the conversations at the break. I'm so sad sometimes the listeners can't eavesdrop on us. But anyways, we're back, and part of the things that we were talking about was let's say you're a vineyard grower and you want to put pollinator habitat in, and you've already kind of constrained the problem. It's like the place it's going to need to go is in the rows and. But what are some of the considerations of getting it established? Is it just a matter of like getting a seed pack and just sprinkling it in the grass and hope for the best, or what do they have to keep in mind?
Yeah, well, I think first is just knowing what to plant, right? I've taken the last 20 years looking around and to think about what would fit into a vineyard alleyway system that, and provide floral resources. Because we mow it and we need to mow it because we drive up and down these hills. We don't want them to catch on fire because they're, under our running tractors. That's a serious consideration. So just knowing what to plant is a mystery to a lot of people. They're busy farming their crop and a lot of them have other jobs too. So, making wine or selling wine, and it's busy. So thinking about, what's growing on your floor is, of minor consideration. So, you can't, I have just now provided this pollinator pathway mix to people this past year, and before that, there really wasn't anything to reach for on the shelf, so to speak. So knowing what to plant is a major obstacle.
Okay.
And then finding the seed, if you did know what to plant. A lot of these flower seeds are really hard to find. You can't just call up, the local farm supply and say, can you get me 3 pounds of alyssum? It's not really the easiest thing to find some of these native flowers, horticultural flowers in the volumes that we need them. And then you want to mix them into your grasses that you can find off the shelf, so to speak. So all those things. Then you need equipment. You need specialized equipment for seeding. Now, could you walk through and broadcast it out of a bucket and then kind of just tickle it in with some sort of a harrow? Yeah, you could. Ideally, though, you drill it. And so that's a specialized piece of equipment.
For our listeners, what is a drill?
So there's seed drills are built to be pulled. It's an implement. They go on the back of a tractor, right? Just like you would put a cultivator or a mower. You could put a seed drill, and they you can calibrate them to drop the seed at a certain rate. So that would depend on how heavy you want it and how big your seed is. And drills have little discs that part the soil and push the seed down to whatever depth you've set your drill at, so that it's actually sowing the seed under the ground. And that's ideal because then you have less, you have good seed soil contact for germination, right? It's going to be kept moist instead of just drying out on the surface. It won't be eaten by birds and beetles on the surface. So you can get away with a lower seed rate if you're drilling it in. If you could broadcast it, there's some spreaders that will sort of just toss the seed out. And then in that case, you'd want to come again behind that pass with something that would, kind of incorporate it down into the soil, ideally. And there's different kinds of drills. There are no-till drills. There are, drop seeders also, which is sort of kind of like a broadcast. So lots of different ways to get seed in the ground, but a lot of vineyardists, at least, don't necessarily have that. There are companies in Oregon that will rent seed drills, and some of the conservation organizations, the Soil Water Conservation Districts, have seed drills that they will lend you. So,
but they're often in high demand.
Out there.
Right. They've got one for the county often, and they're not super available. You have to.
Correct. Yeah, you have to get on the list on the calendar, and it's a tight window of time. I mentioned earlier that September, mid to late September is really the ideal time to sow. And this last fall, we had this luxurious planting window because it just didn't rain. It didn't rain. So we had good planting conditions well into through October, really.
So let me get this straight. With these drills, if you had an established perennial grass row, you would just go through and you would put the seed at the right depth through the grass, or would you have to get rid of the grass? Or tell us a little bit. And I imagine there's two settings. Right. One is an established orchard with its perennial grass in place, and you're setting up a new orchard. I imagine those are two different issues.
It could be. I mean, it has more to do with the competitive aspect of the grass than like what floor actually looks like in, the germination setting. So what you're describing with the getting flowering species into grass is more of an overseeding, what I would call overseeding situation.
Okay.
So that's not so common. It can be successful, but it can be hard to establish something right next to an aggressive, well-established grass.
Okay.
So whatever you're putting in the ground has to have high seedling vigor in order to succeed in that kind of environment. But it is done in the Midwest and for conservation. More commonly, if people want to redo their floors, often you get gophers working up the floors, or you get ruts that happen from just driving on wet ground. And every once in a while, people will just rework the floor to make it smooth again.
Oh, I see.
And
okay.
so that will provide you an opportunity to put down a new mix of seed and start anew. And so, a lot of times a common practice in vineyards is to have alternate row management, where every other row will be cultivated every year, just to back off the degree of competition that's happening in the vineyard.
Earlier in the interview, you were talking about how the grass is a needed competition, but you may have just too much, so you would work up a row and ease the competition up. I gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. So people will alternate. They'll switch which row is cultivated every year, occasionally. So that provides your other opportunity for establishing something new and unique.
But I imagine something like grass, once you have it in place, it's not just a matter of turning it over, the grass will resprout, that there's a kind of things that need to be done to kind of get the grass dead. To put it...
Get that grass dead.
How's that done?
Better the better. Yeah, no, that's actually not as hard as you might think.
Okay.
It's pretty easy to cultivate grass and eliminate it through cultivation,
okay.
Without herbicides. Obviously herbicides are another tool to do that, but it's really not necessary to employ herbicides on the vineyard or in the alleyways. You can just basically use a disc, for example, common cultivation tool. And then you can rototill, or you could use a common tool around here. It's called a 3-in-1. It's basically like a harrow and a tine that just, it breaks up the clods and smooths out the surface. So that's a nice one because it's not quite as pulverizing as a rototiller is. Rototilling can really destroy soil structure. So 3-in-1s will leave small clods, maybe the size of a quarter or something like that, which is, preferable to really pulverizing the soil. Now, if you're putting a fine seed in, though, and like some of these perennial grasses and some of these flowers, a finer seed bed might be justified. So, but that's not something you do every year.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Yeah. That's a nice primer on the options and trade-offs associated with working up the grass and creating the seed bed. And I imagine the second challenge that you've already described is things like the grass may be more competitive, and there may be some forbs that you want to put in that are a little bit more difficult to establish. It's putting it all down at once putting all the seed down at once must be difficult because you've got these different levels of competitiveness in what you're putting down. How does that get dealt with, or is it a concern?
Yeah, it is. It is a concern. With the drill, it's even probably more of a concern because you're putting all of those in little rows down the vineyard floor. Maybe you have 6 to 10 rows that are maybe 4 inches apart or so across the vineyard floor. So all of those seeds are concentrated next to each other in those rows. It'd probably be less of an issue if it was put down with a drop seeder, for example, or broadcast in some other way and then incorporated. But that said, The grasses that I've chosen for the pollinator pathway mix are clumping grasses. They're not running grasses. And my hope is that by so choosing those clumpers, I'm going to leave space for those forbs to establish themselves. And some of the forbs have been already popping up really quick. For example, the meadowfoam and salad burnet have been popping up really well. And also the California poppy is a very recognizable seedling. So, there's some that are going to come up quick, and there's some that are going to come up later. The bird's-foot trefoil is notorious for being a seedling that has low vigor, right? So, although it provides a really great late season flower, it lasts forever once it's established, it might have a hard time in a mix like this. But we won't know until we try.
I remember the interview with Dr. Atez where he said, bird's foot trefoil is one of those perennial legumes that really does better in the second year. It's a slower to establish legume. But I do remember also on some of his plots, some of the Megachilidae, the leaf-cutting bee family, really liked it a lot. So it getting it to establish, and obviously bumblebees. But I really noticed some of the bees in the leaf-cutting family really loved visiting the trefoil. Nice.
Well, I do hope to see it in this mix, if not this year, then next. And I think it's kind of true for a lot of species. In college, in grad school, I worked with Romer's fescue, and it's just a slow grass. A lot of these fine fescues are slow grasses, and both of the grasses in my pollinator pathway are fine fescues and are slow. And so it's going to take a couple years for this pathway mix to really fill in and look like we want it to. And that's just kind of the way it is. We could experiment with some nurse crops, I suppose, and get some faster annuals in there that'll just peter out. And that's definitely worth experimenting with.
One other thing I just wanted to bring, it sounds like in vineyards specifically, there's this fine balance between, being competitive and stressing the plants out slightly. Leguminous plants, we've often heard that leguminous plants can sometimes attract things like voles. But the other thing I'm mindful of is in vineyards, this delicate balance between moisture. I imagine nitrogen fixing must be one of those things that need to be taken into account. Tell us a little bit about leguminous plants in rows and orchards and vineyards.
Sure, yeah. I mean, vineyards need nitrogen just like every other plant needs nitrogen. But again, back to our goal in wine grapes is different from most other agronomic systems in that we are looking for a quality product and not a high yielding product. So our nitrogen needs are going to be much lower. We don't want to have a very vegetative vine that's going to be dense and shady and stop air from flowing through it. So in that case, we want to minimize the amount of nitrogen that we I shouldn't say we want to minimize it. We want to optimize the amount of nitrogen that we have. We don't want to have too much. So in that case, I do discourage planting perennial legumes or legumes that perennialize, like a subclover would function like a perennial because it self-sows and just reestablishes itself. Because then you don't have control over how much nitrogen is being provided by that legume. Now, do we have quote unquote native, which are essentially residential legumes in our vineyards? Yes. I mean, a lot of these were, grazed in the past. These hillsides, were sown, by our forefathers to legumes, or they just got there somehow. And now they're there, and there's not much we can do about that. But in terms of putting new seed of legumes in the ground, I do make sure people are aware of how much they can provide to the system. It's not to be underestimated. And we can provide nitrogen to grapes in other ways with fertilizers, foliar and on the ground when they need it, when they need it and how much they need to a much higher degree of specificity.
Okay, that's fantastic. Well, this sounds like a fascinating venture, and so you've got some right now. You've got some seeds in the ground, so you're testing out some of these mixtures. Tell us a little bit about some of the experiments you have in the ground, and what's the future for Buzz cover crop seeds.
Yeah, well, I sold quite a bit of my Pollinator Pathway, which was sort of my debut seed mix last year, to Western Oregon vineyards. Left Coast is the one that's closest to me that I've been able to check out. I've been watching, what's coming up and talking about how they put it in the ground. And I just honestly have been hunkered down like a lot of other people and haven't been out as much as I had intended to this spring. But it certainly is time to get out and look around some more at this Pollinator Pathway to see how it's doing, make some phone calls. And I know I did hit the ground a little bit late in the season last year. It was hard to find a lot of these flower seeds. And so there was wider interest in the mix than was actually purchased because people had already purchased their perennial seeds for the year at that time. So I'm really hoping that even more people will adopt this seed mix in their vineyards this year. Besides that, I'm providing, as I mentioned earlier, some insectary mixes for people that have conservation biocontrol or just biocontrol objectives on their farms, working with an organic leek grower up in the Skagit Valley and some hops growers also up there, looking for some plants to support their beneficial insects, their natural enemies. Mm-hmm. So beyond pollinators, and also putting together some really exciting pasture mixes, working with a seed company here in near Corvallis, actually, that has decades of experience growing pastures for mostly beef cattle, but also sheep. And so really just thinking about optimizing seed mixes for this Willamette Valley that are multifunctional, that can be grazed, nutritious, holistic nutrition for livestock. There's plants that animals can graze that will help them with their internal parasites, for example. So really thinking about the big picture of your farm and, getting those kinds of plants in your pasture as well as plants for pollinators. We can serve so many functions with every action that we do on the farm, if you just think about all the ways that it can be effective. I have a consulting business also called Corridor Agland Consulting, and I've been working under that for many years before Buzz cover crop seeds came around, and have in that context done some consulting on hedgerows, and multifunctional hedgerows are really a great opportunity to improve diversity on farms. In the live program, so I've been doing inspections for live, low input viticulture and enology.
That's great. We had Ron Bittner, who's a Idaho live grower, was on a couple episodes ago. So remind us a little bit about live and tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, Ron is great. What a great entomologist he is, and
he's amazing.
A great viticulturalist as well, and kind of a pioneer out in Idaho there in the viticultural world. The hedgerows in live came up together because there's a requirement in the live program that 5% of your entire farm holding is in an ecological set-aside. And that's a requirement. You can't plant your entire farm edge to edge with grapevines and be live certified. So I think that's just outstanding and unique among farm certifications. And oftentimes when there's little room to scrape out that 5% on the farm because the vineyard's already been established, and then they come to the program and they go, oh, I really don't have 5%. Maybe I've got 4.5. Then we start talking about hedgerows, because you can take up that vertical space with floral resources, right? Then we're talking about surface area. We're not talking about floor acreage. Right. That's a conversation that continues to evolve in the live program. So that's pretty exciting. I love to see how the direction that this is going in. The live program in this past 2 or 3 years has really done a lot of work on creating an ecological tool that like a self-assessment tool, and where people can have a look at their farm and ask themselves a set of questions in order to assess what their ecological resources are. And so, yeah, pretty proud to be part of that program.
Well, fantastic. I think you've given us all of us stuck at home some really great ideas. I imagine some of these same principles can be used in all sorts of different farms, but probably, grass grows on lawns. So there's all sorts of ways these ideas can come into play. And so thanks so much for taking time to bring us up to speed on all of this fascinating and very kind of nuanced world of doing pollinator plantings in vineyards.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Anthony. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sinan-Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.